In class, we had started to discuss the art of Northern Europe in the 16th century. On the one hand, we saw a continuing interest in detailed particulars. The sorts of things that we had seen so wonderfully in the works of Jan van Eyck continue into 16th century works of art in Northern Europe, Germany, and the Low Countries. On the other hand, we saw a shift. With Jan van Eyck, the details are used to elaborate on traditional religious symbolism. But what we see in the 16th century is that details are used to enhance a particular moral allegory. It still has religious undertones, but it's not a traditional religious scene in the same way. On the left here, we see Hieronymus Bosch's most famous work, and really his most misunderstood work as well, which does exactly this. Uses microscopic details, tiny particulars, in order to enhance an overall moral allegory, a lesson on how to live properly. And that lesson taught to us by showing us how not to live, and using that as an example, as a warning on how we should live. Now, you can see from the overall format that it's a triptych. It's a three-winged work where the two side wings fold over the center. This is a traditional form that's most often used for altarpieces. We saw two or three examples. Probably the most famous is the Ghent altarpiece, which Hieronymus Bosch might well have known. That might suggest that the Garden of Earthly Delights on your left is a religious work, but it's not. We know that it was commissioned by a duke to be seen in his palace in a non-religious environment. And the fact that Bosch uses a religious format, a triptych, suggests maybe some sort of commentary, perhaps even some mockery. And as we look at the work, we're going to see that satire is a main element of this work. But what Bosch is making fun of is not religion itself, but what Bosch is making fun of are the actions of his fellow man. And that's what we'll look at as we look at the Garden of Earthly Delights in detail. The name of the work of art comes from the center panel, where we see that this distant landscape, we have a sort of aerial view down on the landscape, is populated entirely by nude figures. And these figures are reveling in lustful behavior. We see a rather healthy, if you will, or maybe even unhealthy display of eroticism and nudity everywhere. And Bosch's presentation of these nude figures is all frolic and fun, all sorts of goofy acrobatics, coupled by the fact that they ride these different animals, some of them rather cute, like our cat unicorn, some of them kind of Dr. Seuss-like as well. As we look at these figures riding around the pond in the center of the center panel, we find all sorts of interesting ways in which they've mounted their animals. This figure here, for example, riding on the back, a pair of figures riding on the back of a camel laying down on its hump. This figure here, rather acrobatically riding his horse on one foot and rather proud of his own genitalia, getting a view back to his own penis. And you'll notice that he doesn't seem to mind the fact that that bird resting on his leg is violating him from behind. It all seems, in fact, very carefree, despite what we see going on. Everybody's having far too good of a time, and that's part of the message, I think, on a certain level. If we look inside the pool at the center, we see a bunch of lovely young maidens with birds on their heads, others seated on the side of the pool, a couple in the water. It looks like it's Olympic team water dancing. But again, there's a general frivolousness, lightheartedness to all of this activity, as if Bosch is presenting it to us without any judgment. Some of them are really quite funny. Here is a couple inside a mussel shell, copulating. And you can tell by their feet coming out that they're busily engaged in having sex. And you'll notice that it looks as if he is crapping pearls. The pearls are coming out of his butt and becoming the pearls inside this mussel shell, which is interesting because, of course, mussels don't produce pearls. Oysters do. But nonetheless, there we are. There's also this just overall look of lack of judgment has complicated many people's understanding of the work. They think that he's perhaps condoning this behavior, when in fact, if we look more closely, we find that he isn't. Fruit seems to be a very prominent motif running through the Garden of Earthly Delights, and many of the people are deeply engaged with fruit. We see here a man lugging an oversized strawberry, other figures picking apples or perhaps huge currants out of a tree and eating them. And the more we look, the more we see that really fruit is everywhere we look. It's a major part of the frolicking that's taking place. We look in the background, for example. Here's a group of figures coming out of some sort of husk and clamoring, lusting after a piece of fruit that's been skewered on this bird's beak. Here's another group, almost as if they're worshiping fruit, as if it were an idol, kneeling around it in the deep landscape in the back. Certainly large fruit being partaken of by everyone together and looking directly out at us as if to say, isn't this wonderful? Isn't it fun? In this case, a figure masked in fruit as he seduces the young woman next to him. I presume it's a him, with a blueberry for a head. So really, fruit is everywhere, and is a central part of this overall theme. And that's important because what we see, and we look at it as part of a triptych, is that there's a figure here with fruit on her head and others around. That in the left-hand panel we have the Garden of Eden, where we know that man partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And so what this suggests is that within the central scene we see the outcome of having taken that fruit, the fruit motif, enhancing that. And so here in the lower left corner of the central panel we see somebody pointing from the left panel to the Garden of Eden, or excuse me, from the central panel to the Garden of Eden in the left. And you'll notice that that figure is actually pointing directly at Eve, which again is typical. It's always Eve's fault. Women are primarily to blame for this. So there's a connection, as we can see in the landscape, from Eden on the left-hand side to this garden of earthly pleasure, the Garden of Earthly Delights in the center. It is going to be the fall of man that inspires this action, this activity. The central theme of the left-hand panel is God, looking very much like Jesus, blessing the union of Adam and Eve. He has just created Eve from the rib of Adam, and he is now presenting her to him and looking out at us. She still seems demure. She still seems as if she's going to obey God. We, of course, know that's not the case. But this is kind of important because the moment that we see here is a moment well before the original sin, well before Eve picks the fruit of the tree of knowledge and asks Adam to join her. You'll notice behind Eve that there are these bunny rabbits, one with his back to us, another one huddled up under the base of that mound. These rabbits with Adam and Eve should make us wonder whether Bosch knew Albrecht Dürer's famous print of Adam and Eve, where we also have the little bunny rabbit, as we discussed in class, directly behind Eve in both of them, and again with his back to us. It seems altogether likely that Bosch did, in fact, know this. And if we go a step further and look behind Adam, you'll notice that just off of Adam's hand in Bosch's work, we have a cat with a mouse in its mouth, walking off rather proudly with its prey. This again relates to a theme that appeared in Durer's Adam and Eve, where the mouse in the bottom here and the cat here are at peace yet because the original sin hasn't happened. Well, with Bosch's work, original sin hasn't happened either, and yet the cat and the mouse are at odds. We have discord, we have disharmony. And it brings up an interesting question about Bosch. What's his overall comment here on the state of mankind? Is there discord in the universe before the fall of man even happens? And that seems to be something that he's telling us here. That either mankind is intrinsically bad, it's not entirely Eve's fault, we just are bad, the world is a bad place. Or that maybe this is all part of the divine plan, that it's going to be this way anyway, regardless of what Adam and Eve do. But our symbol for disharmony here, derived from Durer's symbol for harmony, is accentuated by the fact that the serpent hasn't even come over to Eve yet. He's there, he's wrapped around the tree, but he hasn't made any contact with the first couple yet. He hasn't yet tempted her, right? But disharmony is everywhere in Bosch's Garden of Eden. A pair of birds tear apart an amphibian here, some sort of toad-like creature, being ripped apart by these amphibians. Deeper in the background, a lion eats a deer. A dragon spits fire immediately next to it. There are various monstrosities everywhere. A three-headed bird, a fish with wings, a unicorn seahorse, crawling everywhere we look. These extraordinary monsters in the Garden of Eden. In the background, another three-headed figure crawling up on shore. Bosch loves these hybrid creatures that appear everywhere. And in this case, they seem to be suggesting, these monstrosities do, that evil is everywhere already, even in advance of the fall of man. And to drive this point home, at the center of the Garden of Eden is this fountain in the middle of a lake, or this structure. And in the oculus, the opening of the structure, is an owl. Now, owls can see at night. They're nocturnal animals. And as such, they were usually seen as a symbol of perversity, of knowledge of evil, since they can see in the dark. And certainly here, I think, it's suggesting that evil is here already present. He's looking out toward the foreground, toward the first couple, as they prepare to join together. Again, to connect to the center panel, just down from that and on the edge of the center panel, a man embraces another owl. So the evil that's present in the Garden of Eden, that's brought forth through the fall of man, is the evil that's being enacted for us in the center panel. You'll notice that this figure with his arms around the owl seems to be presenting that owl to us. Behold, here is the source of the activities. They may be frolicking, and we see them as frolicking, but they're practicing perversity. And that's the theme of the central panel. So Bosch's presentation of it as frolicking is because that's how the people in the panel see it. But it's not how he wants us to see it. He wants us to understand it as a work of art that is, in fact, showing us the dangers of exactly this kind of behavior. So if the left-hand figure panel shows us the source of evil in the world, and the center the center panel shows us humanity enacting that evil with quite a bit of gusto. The right-hand panel then continues and completes the cycle and shows us the punishment of that behavior, where the landscape, the verdant landscape, erupts in a series of explosive flames in the background. This is hell itself, and the punishment of the pleasures that we humans try to bring ourselves during our lives, as allegorized in the center panel. Now, the right-hand panel centers on this man with an egg-shaped body whose legs are trees and who has a face. This is often suggested to be a self-portrait of Bosch. There's no way to prove that, but it's an interesting premise. The way he looks back to his egg belly and out toward us suggests that if this is indeed Bosch, no one is safe from this judgment. He may assume a bird's eye view of all of the sin in the center panel, but he too is prime for judgment here. Inside his egg belly is a tavern, and you can see that there's drinks being served. Man has hung his arms, his crossbow outside. A woman pours wine from a vat on the left, but it doesn't seem to be a particularly happy place with this tavern in his belly. But that still is the most prominent figure in this image of hell. And the idea is that revelry leads immediately to judgment. And that's what we'll see play out through the rest of the panel. Everywhere we look, we see people punished in horrible and yet inventive ways. Here in the foreground, we see a rabbit dressed as a hunter, blowing a horn to call his dogs, holding a lance over his shoulder. The rabbit is hunting people, and you see his dogs now attacking a person directly in front of him. The tables are turned. The man who once hunted rabbits is now the hunted. Another person has been strung up on that lance, his stomach erupting. He's the prey that the dogs have already caught. In the background, we have a soldier, presumably based on St. George, a Christian soldier with a goblet signifying the communion, and he's being torn apart by dragons, the dragons who these kinds of Christian knights usually conquer, but they are ripping him apart in a rather bloody, gory mess. Directly beneath him, we see a figure's body draped over the sharp edge of a huge knife. Again, there's this sense of these inventive and horrifying ways that we will be punished in hell. Make no doubt about it, the activities in the center lead toward this horrible fate. Many people in hell are punished by the ways that brought them pleasure in life. We see quite a few analogies to gambling, pastimes that might be seen as interesting or innocuous and innocent, now being part of the punishment that people see in hell. Here we see a backgammon board with dice, a figure looking in terror at it as he's beset by these demons everywhere we look. A figure directly below it with a knife plunged deep into his back. Behind it, a demon with a heart skewered on a sword. More allusions to gambling and non-productive pastimes directly below that. A severed hand nailed to a shield with, again, another dice off its fingertips on the back of this toad rat-like creature who's attacking this man against a table, an upturned table, with another sword skewering his hand. Other figures in hell are punished by things that brought them pleasure in life. A man tied to a lute, a musical instrument. Another man crucified on a lyre, on a harp. How they actually did this is anybody's guess. But the bottom line is that music, which is itself a fine pastime and brings us pleasure during life, is now going to bring us suffering in hell. there's the exact metaphor for the center. If you participate in pleasure during life, there's a price to pay. The music is written not only on books at the bottom, but right on the bum, on the ass of a recumbent figure, and somebody has actually transposed this music and played it. You can find that online. Here another figure is tied to a flute that's being played by this red-faced figure, a man stuck inside the flute with the breath coming out around him. Down below that, a figure beats on a drum, and a man stuck inside that drum. We've all had that kind of headache at some point in our life. On the left, there's a hurdy-gurdy. You crank the handle and it makes music, and the man that's cranking it is himself kind of being cranked, I guess, is a good way of putting it, having his behind violated by another figure, as if to wind him up. Inside the hurdy-gurdy, a woman looking like a nun playing some bells attached to a triangle. So things that might bring us pleasure in life are now, of course, bringing us trauma and torment. There's been some suggestion that if we look hard enough, we'll find all 7 of the deadly sins. Here, a woman looking at her reflection in a convex mirror while she's being groped by this rat-like creature, a toad crawling on her chest. She probably is meant to represent vanity, not realizing that being so caught up in her own appearance is in fact what is now tormenting her. And you'll notice that that convex mirror ends up being very much like the buttocks of another sort of strange creature with trees for legs. All of this takes place under the watchful guise of Satan, who sits on a throne in the lower right corner. He's devouring souls. We see him eating a figure whose anus is on fire, and birds are flying out of him. As Satan digests these figures, he then defecates them through these distended crystal bowels into an even deeper level of hell, where people puke and defecate coins, and more souls are suffering even more horrific fates down below. The fact that Satan is a bird eating these figures again ties back to the central panel, where we see just as many birds as we see pieces of fruit. You see how Bosch is inventively tying these things together. And so here, as this couple begins to fornicate, as he grabs her for some lovemaking, there's a bird right nearby who's tempting other figures with a raspberry, while a man rides complacently on its back. It may look like a simple bird, it may look like something pretty in nature, but the right-hand panel tells us that no, these are Satan's messengers out to tempt us, and it's best that we not listen to them at all, that we do not participate in the kind of activity that we see in the central panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights. So the bottom line is, if we take the wings into consideration, there is only really one way to interpret this picture. The central panel is sin being enacted by these various figures. In the left-hand panel, we see where sin originated with God's plan for humanity, and in the right-hand panel, we see what's going to happen. Sin will be punished in hell at the end of time. It is in keeping with most 16th century Northern works that we looked at in class. It has a very, very strong moral allegory, teaching us how to behave by showing us what happens when we're bad.